Think I want to build some machining Krieger. This time, it's going to be a stompy bug. Now, I've obviously done some work on the model, getting it all ready into sub-assemblies. The assembly on this is fantastic. There's no problems at all. Just a couple of minor seam lines to fill in along this area back here, and that's pretty much it. There are a few places that I did the little thing of putting some Mr. Surfacer where parts were glued together and then cleaning it up with a Q-tip soaked in alcohol. But aside from that, this thing goes together just perfectly. I highly recommend this kit. But after I got it together and got it primed, I was getting ready to do a video about painting the interior. I thought, you know what, I want to add some detail to the interior. And even though not much of it will be seen, just for the fun of doing it. So that's what this video is going to concentrate on, is while it will be specific to this model, the techniques and things I try to talk about are going to be specific, or going to be generic enough that it can be applied to any model. Now, the first thing I look at when deciding if I'm going to do any scratch building, and I'm going to be doing a lot on this one, frankly, because there's not a lot of room. But the first thing I look at is there room? How much can be seen? Now, the fact that not a lot of this will be seen might suggest, well, why bother? But I think there is merit in sometimes doing things, even if they're not really going to be seen, simply for the exercise of doing them, for gaining the experience. People quite often ask me, well, how do you get experience? Because so many things in our hobby require repetition, experience, trying it out, that kind of thing. Many people ask me, how do I get experience if I'm not able to build a lot? And what I suggest is that you squeeze every bit of things out of whatever it is you're building. If there's a chance to scratch build, try scratch building. If there's a chance to do some new weathering technique, try that out. Work in, even if you're only building a few models a year, work in as many opportunities to do things, even if they're not going to be seen, even if they're not going to be very dramatic, so that you'll get the experience of doing them. Now, you can see that the cockpit tub assembly here is a very tight space. It snaps together so I can put it together fairly easily and then take it back apart. And there's not a lot of space to actually do something. But what there is there's some area right here along the sidewall that I think I can put some stuff in, just a few little greeblies to make that stand out. There's this area behind the seat here, which I think could use just a few little things. And then there's this instrument panel, which if this guy comes to a stop too fast, he's going to face plant right into it, but we'll kind of overlook that. There's a place here that I can add a little more detail. Now, like I said, once it's up under here, there's not going to be a lot of that seen, not much at all. But that's okay. Again, the idea is not necessarily, okay, how much of this is going to be seen, but how much practice, how much work can I get in based on what's here to do some additional detailing. Now you can see how I've already done a little bit of extra detailing. The pilot is nicely cast, has the seat straps cast in. It looks pretty good. And he's got this oxygen mask on, but it just kind of terminated there in this little nub. And so what I did was I drilled a hole in the end of his oxygen mask, and then I stuck in a piece of lead solder wire, which I'm going to be showing a little more of here in a minute. And I had it cut long enough that it would hang down. And then to make sure that this would fit up against the front of the cockpit tub there, I just carved out a little channel for that to go in, because that won't be seen once it's in the model. And that way it would stay clear of interfering with the fit. But the little tube would go right down there and appear to just kind of go down between his knees and nobody will see that. I've named the pilot Stumpy for obvious reasons, but that's just one little bit of detailing that I did before I decided to actually make this a detailing video. But that's just one little bit of detailing I did that was very simple to do. Another little bit I did was there's this smoke discharger that goes on the back, and they've got one on either side. Well, I thought it would look cool if maybe one of them had been broken off. So all I did there was drilled a hole in where these were supposed to mount. These came as multi-part pieces that you had to glue each of these smoke dischargers on. So I just drilled a hole where right here where one of the dischargers would have been, and then I stuck in some very thin, this is just jeweler's wire. Let's see if it's 28 gauge, very thin, very stiff wire, and it'll stick the devil out of you if you're not careful. I found out that. But I just put in 3 pieces of wire, stuck it in through the back, super glued it in, trimmed off the excess back here, and then just kind of bent it down, as you can see right there. And then when I glued this whole assembly in, I just kind of bent it down also so that it looks like it snagged on something, tore that off, and bent the whole unit down. And so that just 3 little wires and a missing piece can add some visual interest to any model that you're building. So look for things that you can essentially break. Now, when it comes to adding detail to your models, scratch building, whatever you want to call it, there are more options of tools and materials and things available than I could go over in one video. But what I have here are what I think are some of the very basic tools that will make it easy to do and give you a lot of flexibility in doing that. Now, of course, you'll need a hobby knife. You'll need to be able to cut things. So you've probably already got that on your desk. Having some sheet plastic available. I use stuff from a brand called Evergreen, and there are many other brands. And it's fairly affordable in terms of what we normally spend for models and things like that, and you'll get a lot of uses out of this. So I'm not suggesting that you go out and buy all of this at one time. I mean, if you have the budget to do it, sure, go ahead. But this is the kind of stuff that you can collect a little at a time and just add to what you've done. That's what I've done. I started off with just some very thin, I don't even remember what thickness this is, some evergreen sheet styrene, and it's just very thin, almost paper thin. And you can see that I've used this piece and this other piece here fairly frequently. There's little bits cut out, and I just keep that in the drawer. Why I cut that right out in the middle, I don't know. But you can see that it's just fairly thin, very flexible, and easy to cut and use. And it's probably what I'm going to be using mostly on this model because of the very small spaces involved. But they make other sheet styrene. This is 2 millimeter and 0.75 millimeter. So if you're needing to build something that's more structurally heavy, they make very thick sheets that you can get. There's also a variety of rods and other things that you can get. They come in longer packages like this, but you'll see here's a very thin kind of plastic rod. This plastic rod is just a little thicker, and they have loads of thicknesses and shapes. Here's some that is square. It's not round, it's square. So that can save you from having to cut long strips off of something like this to have that. And this is actually in the shape of a channel. You can kind of see, if I can get that up close, you can kind of see how that's shaped. And that can be really handy in scratch building to have the shapes already there in the styrene. Now, other things that I like using this, this is just lead solder. It's from Radio Shack. I think they've closed down, but there's other sources of it. But it's easy to bend, easy to cut, very easy to work with. You do need super glue to glue this to plastic, but it's it's good stuff to have around. And then I've already talked about this a little bit. This is just some jeweler's wire. It's very stiff, and there's a lot of different gauges and sizes and things like that. But having just some thin wire will help add to the flexibility of things you can do when you're trying to add detail to your models. And then some other things that certainly are not required but are helpful. I have these scribing templates, and these are good for scribing. They're meant for scribing in panel lines and access hatches and things like that onto the surface of a model. But they're also great for just laying down on this sheet plastic and then taking a needle and a pin vise and just kind of tracing around it. And once you get a good groove going, you can just break off the excess plastic, and you're left with these fairly complex shapes that you can glue on the model. These are from a company called Techstar. I got them at the local hobby shop, and I've had them, you can tell, but they've been used also. And I got them many years ago. But there are other types like this available. And then another thing that I find really handy is this punch and die set. And it's just a little metal base with a clear part over the top and holes drilled. And then these little pieces of metal like that, and you stick the plastic underneath, and you punch through, and you get little plastic discs. So this is really handy in scratch building. But again, I think not all of this is required. At a minimum, I would say start off with some thin sheet plastic and maybe a couple of sizes of rod, although you could use stretched sprue for this. The benefit of having the pre-made rod is the width is consistent. Sometimes when you stretch sprue out, the width is not always consistent, but it's a great way to save money. Now the first thing I want to do is add some instrument detail right here. Now I don't worry about whether that makes sense or not, because he's already got these two heads-up displays. So having some round old-style analog dials, it may not make sense in a real-world way, but I think from a detail standpoint, it'll just look interesting. So that's where I'm going to start. First thing I'm going to do is just take a piece of tape and line that up right along the top of those multi-function displays. It's kind of at an awkward angle, so I'm going to have to do it off camera so I can hold it steady in place, but I'm just going to cut the tape. I've turned it face down, and I'm just going to cut the tape right along there to end up with a template for what I want the plastic card to be shaped like. Alright, I've cut out that piece of tape, and it just serves as a little cutting template for the plastic card here. Now, when I make the cut, I'm not actually going to cut all the way through. I'm just going to run the knife along it several times to score it. And once it's scored enough so that I can proceed, all I'm going to do is just break that part off. You don't have to cut all the way through, because if I push down hard enough, especially on this very thin card, if I push down hard enough to cut all the way through it, it can deform it, and I'll end up with a shape that I don't want. So I'll just lightly score it and then break it off. I am going to need to do that off camera so that I can see what I'm doing. I have to get right up close to it because of my poor eyesight. But that's all I'm going to be doing. Now you can see there where I've cut the score in. And again, I didn't cut all the way through it. That was basically 2 passes with the knife, just putting a little pressure on there. And now all I'll do is just push that back and forth like that. It breaks off cleanly. And now there may be a few rough edges, but those can be sanded or cut off. I positioned the card that I cut out here on my punch and die set and centered it under this fairly large hole, or this die here. And then all I'm going to do is use this decidedly low-tech hammer, which is my bottle of Tamiya Extra Thin, and punch that through like that. That's how I know that it's punched through. I push it on through. And then what I'm left with, an instrument face right there in the middle of it. Now I'm going to do one more of these smaller ones on one side, And I may try to get in two on another side, or I may just mirror it on both sides. I'm not sure which. But again, let me do that off camera so that I can get right up on what I'm doing. All right, it's not exact, but I'll call that close enough for government work. I scraped the primer off the instrument panel, and I'm going to just put a spread of Tamiya extra thin cement right there. I don't want to flood it because that plastic card is very thin and it will deform easily. And then I'm just going to take this, put it right there, and then I'm just going to take the edge of my blade and I'm going to pull that into place. All right, I had to go off camera to see what I was doing, but what I did was I made sure that the bottom edge here was lined up just barely above those multifunction displays, like that. And now what I'll do is I'll give this a chance to dry, because there's going to be a little bit that I'll need to cut off right there, but I want to wait until that glue completely dries. Now while I'm waiting for the glue to dry that's holding it onto the instrument panel, I use my punch and die set to cut out two small discs that I glued here, and then on either of these sides I got these little bezels. By punching the die very hard, and what it actually did was it drove the disc into the cutting mat, and by doing that it left a tiny ring around the punch. So when I pulled the punch out, I could pull that little tiny ring off and carefully glue that on, and so it leaves me with some instrument bezels like that sticking out. So I've got not only some recessed detail, but some raised detail. And when I paint this, that'll give me more opportunities to give some color variation and some distinction and things like that. And I'll drop in some Mike Grant instrument panel decals in these little areas, and they'll look like instrument panels. Now another thing I want to do is I want to add just some sidewall detail right in these areas right here. Now again, there's not a lot of this that's going to be seen, and that's not a lot of space to add things to. But I want to do it, one, for the exercise of doing it, but two, I think it's just fun to do sometimes. Every now and then the notion hits me, so I say, well, let me do this. Now, there's a couple of ways I could do this. I could just glue some greeblies in along here and keep test fitting the pilot, and once I had them in there, paint them up, and it would look good. Now, another way to do it that would make painting a little easier would be to cut out an insert to go in there so that I could put the parts on the insert and then stick that in. Now, the decision between doing one or the other is completely up to you. It would be just as good to just glue the parts directly to the sidewall in this case. But I want to demonstrate doing the insert because in some cases that is going to work better. And since that's just a little more difficult, I'll show that. And then you can decide which would work best for whatever model you're working on. Now, as I did with the instrument panel, I'm going to start by sticking some tape down in here to create a template. And once the tape is in there, I'm going to begin cutting away the excess so that I get the contours of that side panel. Now once I have my tape template like that, I'm going to stick it on to my plastic card here, and I'm going to leave enough room around all the edges so that I have to make a cut on all edges, and that way it gives me a little something to break off. I don't want to trust that this edge is straight, so I'll put it there like that, and I'll begin scoring around the tape template. Now once I have that roughly cut out, I'll just put the pilot back in and I'll start test fitting this in there, and when I feel some resistance, I know that I'll need to do some cutting, so I need to cut some off the bottom there, and then once I get that in there, then I'll make sure that it lines up with the contours. So it's just a process at this point of test fitting to see, does it fit in there and align to the contours of the cockpit edge. My goal is to make it fit up at the forward corner and along the contours the best. Everything else will just kind of disappear behind the seat. So I just got to go through a series of test fittings to make that happen. And once I've gone through that process of test fitting and cutting and sanding, I can just slide that right in there and it should go in fairly easily and fit exactly where I want it. Now it's at the stage that I can start putting things on it and then later slide it into the cockpit. And then after I knew that this piece fit, I put it back on my plastic card and used it as a template to cut out another one. Now with both of those in place, I just kind of eyeball it and see where do I have space to work with to add on some little greeblies or some other things. You can mark this with a pencil, or you can just do like I do and live dangerously and eyeball it. But that's going to be where I add some extra detail. Now when it comes to deciding what detail to add, it's entirely up to you. You can look at reference photos if it's a real world thing. If it's something like this that's science fiction, you can just kind of make it up as you go along. And one of the things I like to do is just take little bits of scrap plastic that I've cut away from the parts that I'm going to be using and use those to make little panels and other things that will stand out on the surface. For example, I can just use this piece here that was cut away from this larger part, and I can just cut that and watch the part go jumping off. And once I've got it back, I can now use that to just put that up on the panel there and know that it fits along the contour. And I could use my disc that I used earlier, my punch and die, to cut out discs, or I could drill holes in it ahead of time so that it looks like a recessed detail. I could use my lead solder wire to run some wire up to it, or the finer jeweler wire. But the process here is just adding on details that you think are going to look cool. And it doesn't take a lot. Just a few little buttons or circles or squares, maybe a couple of layers of things so that they build up more than just one layer deep. Anything like that is going to give just some effect of volume, some effect of shape, so that when somebody looks in, they may not fully see the detail, but they can see that there's additional shapes and features there, and it just sells the notion of realism. So let me do a little bit of cutting and gluing, and I'll show you what those look like. A quick note, all along the way, you're going to want to go in and just drop the part in and test fit it to make sure that it's fitting where you want and how you want. Now here you can see that I've got several little parts in there, and now it just gives it some details along that sidewall that when somebody looks in real closely, they'll see some little raised bumps and some things that just indicate other stuff going on there. Now one thing to keep in mind that I've found helpful over the years as I've done this is take one of the parts that's going to go on the sidewall and cut it out and set it aside and keep a separate third template so that if you mess up anything, because I've done this before, if you mess up anything gluing stuff to the sidewall and it doesn't fit and you can't go back and fix it, you've got a spare template that doesn't have anything on it that you can cut things, that you can cut a new one and start again. Because anytime you're doing the scratch building process, not everything will go perfect, and you have to be prepared to make some changes. Now another thing that can add interest is looking for places to add wires. And I noticed that these two little parts that are already cast in have recesses in them. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to drill a hole in each of them. And once I have the hole drilled, I can just put a small piece of my lead solder wire right there and just bend that down. And then I can come back later with just a dot of super glue here and a dot at the other end, and that'll hold it in place. Once I prime it, now I've got a little bit of wire detail that shows here along the back wall, and I can do the same thing right here. Alright, I've got everything added on that I want to add on, and you can see here that it's just giving it some little greeblies and some little points of interest that, while much of it may not be seen from outside the cockpit, The fun of doing it and the experience of doing it is well worth it, I believe, because modeling for me is a quest for experience to gain knowledge about the hobby. So the more things that I do to do that, the more I learn, even if it's not going to be seen, even if it's not really prominent on the model. The time spent here is going to help me down the road when it may be more visible. Now, what I've shown here in this video are obviously just some very simple techniques, but they're the basic foundational techniques for any scratch building that you do. It's simply get an idea of what you want, measure where you're going to put something, start cutting out the basic shapes, refine them, and put them in place. There's a lot of materials and tools that can be used, and you can always start very simple. Just start with some sheet plastic and your hobby knife. Maybe add in a little hand drill and some other just items as you go along as the need arises. And you'll have a whole stable of tools eventually that are ready and waiting to execute whatever you imagine in your head. Well, thank you so much for watching this video. I am grateful, and I'm especially grateful if you're still watching at this point. Let's have a little fun like I like to do sometimes. And if you're still watching at this point, why not drop a comment down below that just says, scratch that itch. And I'll know what you're talking about, and everybody else that doesn't watch the whole video will scratch their head and wonder, what's that all about? But that'll just let me know that you watched to the end, and we can have a little fun with that. Of course, there's a subscribe link down over here. If you've not already done so, please hit that subscribe button. I would be grateful for that. And there are links down below to social media and to my Patreon. So if you would like to support the work that I do, please consider supporting me on Patreon. And if you're already a Patreon supporter, thank you so much for that. I am so grateful because what you do makes this possible. We just couldn't do it apart from your support. So thank you very much. And with all that being said, I'll leave you with one final thought, as I always like to do. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.